All right, so we are in chapter 8, which is the nervous system. We'll look at the nervous system in this way, how it's organized, and then some of the disorders at the end. The two major divisions that we briefly talked about in chapter 7 are, again, your central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Your central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord. It integrates incoming information and coordinates all voluntary and involuntary nervous functions. And your peripheral nervous system consists of all ganglia, and the ganglia are just enlarged portions of neurons that are contained usually cell bodies and the nerves that branch from your central nervous system. The PNS keeps your central nervous system in contact with the rest of the body. Subdivisions of your peripheral nervous system are based on their function. The somatic nervous system receives sensory information and directs voluntary movements, and your autonomic nervous system regulates involuntary activities. And your autonomic nervous system is divided into your sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic is in charge during emergencies, so we call it the fight or flight response. And the parasympathetic nervous system adjusts bodily functions during restful times. So we call this the rest and digest nervous system. So here's your central nervous system getting input and then telling the motor output what should happen for that input. Here's some sensory input. Within the peripheral nervous system, it can come from sensory receptors to external stimuli, sensory receptors in your skin, muscles, and joints, and sensory receptors in internal organs. So everything is picking up sensory input, sending it to the brain or spinal cord to be processed. And then the brain and spinal cord send out an action or a motor response. That motor response can be somatic or autonomic. Somatic just means it's voluntary. And autonomic means it happens automatically, so involuntary body activities such as heart rate and breathing. And your autonomic nervous system, we divide into a parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Your parasympathetic has all the rest and digest activities that governs bodily activities during restful conditions. And your sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, prepares the body for stressful or emergency situations. Your central nervous system is protected by the bones of the skull and the vertebral column. There's also 3 connective tissue membranes that form meninges, or layers, around your skull, or your brain and your vertebral column. The dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater are the 3 meninge layers. Meningitis is inflammation of these meninge layers, and it's caused by bacteria and viruses that can lead to encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain. Remember, whenever you see the word ending in itis, that means inflammation. Cerebral spinal fluid and blood-brain barrier, we'll talk about those. Cerebral spinal fluid fills spaces between the connective tissue layers, those meninges. It fills spaces, the ventricles in the brain, and the central canal, which is a cavity within the spinal cord. And your cerebral spinal fluid helps as a shock absorber support, and it helps to nourish brain tissue, nervous system tissue, and also remove wastes. The blood-brain barrier is formed by tight junctions between cells and the walls of capillaries supplying the central nervous system. And your blood-brain barrier is important for protecting your central nervous system by selecting which substances can enter your cerebral spinal fluid from the blood. So your blood-brain barrier can inhibit many potentially life-saving, infection-fighting, or tumor-suppressing drugs from reaching brain tissue if they are not lipid-soluble. If they're lipid-soluble, they could pass through it. So here's the bones of the skull are hard, and the vertebral column is hard to act as the first protection against the brain and spinal cord. And then you have meninge layers, 1, 2, 3, that are layers of connective tissue that connect to the brain and spinal cord themselves. And then this is showing the ventricles of the brain, which are just spaces within the brain itself that are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And you can see where the central canal goes down the middle of the spinal column here as well. The cerebrum is what you think of when you think of the thinking conscious part of the brain. It's about 83% of your total brain weight. It's separated into two halves or hemispheres by the longitudinal fissure, and each hemisphere receives sensory information from and directs movements of the opposite side of the body. So your right hemisphere of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body. Each hemisphere has a thin outer layer called the cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer of gray matter, and there's a white matter layer beneath it. So here's a look at the cerebrum and some structures as we look at a sagittal or cross-section view of the cerebrum, and some of the structures within the cerebrum that you'll eventually learn what each structure means. Gray matter includes neuroglial cells, nerve cell bodies, and anything that's unmyelinated, so axons that do not have myelin on them. White matter consists mostly of myelinated axons, and that's because myelin is white, so your white matter looks white because it has myelinated axons. The white matter allows for communication between various areas of the brain and between the brain and spinal cord. And the corpus callosum is a band of white matter that connects the two cerebral hemispheres together. If we go back to this picture, here's your corpus callosum. It's this area of white matter that connects the two halves of the cerebrum together. There's grooves on the surface of the brain that mark the boundaries of the following four lobes. Frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe are really named for the skull bones that will surround them. So here are the different lobes of the brain, and each lobe of the brain is associated with a different function of the brain. So hearing words is in your temporal lobe, which is by your ears. Seeing words takes place in the visual association center in the occipital lobe. Speaking words takes place in your frontal lobe, the speech area, and reading words takes place more in your parietal and occipital lobes. The brain contains sensory, motor, and association areas. The sensory areas are specifically found within the primary somatosensory area that receives all sensory information from the body. Your motor areas is the primary motor area that controls all skeletal muscles, and the premotor cortex coordinates learned motor skills. So anything that you would learn over time, like riding a bike or roller skating. The association areas communicate with sensory motor and other parts of the brain to analyze and act on sensory input, and the prefrontal cortex enables us to reason and think. So this is a look at the primary motor areas found in blue in this part of the brain, and the primary somatosensory areas found in green. And each part of the body is controlled by a different part of the brain. So if you look at the green sensory area, these parts of the body receive sensory stimulus on this part of the brain. So over here, way on the left side of the brain, you'll receive sensory information from your tongue, your teeth, your gums. Your fingers actually and thumb have a huge portion of sensory information of the brain because there's so many neurons within your fingers and your thumbs. So that allows for the ability to sense things very easily in your fingers and thumb. Same thing for the motor area. These parts of the brain control motor functions of your tongue, your jaw, a lot of your facial features are controlled. They get a big part of the brain. You'll notice your knee and leg, which are big parts of the body, your trunk and hip, they just get a small part of the brain, whereas your fingers, wrist, and elbow get a huge part of the brain for motor control. The thalamus serves as the relay station of the brain for all sensory information except smell. So it directs motor activity, cortical arousal, and memory. So your thalamus is kind of what we call the screening point for all sensory information that comes into the brain, and it chooses what it will go on and send to the different lobes of the brain. The hypothalamus maintains homeostasis by regulating blood pressure and all those things listed there. And your hypothalamus is really what coordinates your nervous and endocrine systems by influencing the pituitary gland, which releases many of your hormones. It also regulates emotions as part of the limbic system. The cerebellum is then the portion of the brain that's in the posterior part of the brain. This will integrate information from your motor cortex and sensory pathways to produce smooth, well-timed voluntary movements. It works to compare actual position of a body part to where it ought to be. And also it works to predict, calculates future body positions of a body part during movement. And we call that proprioception. And it also controls equilibrium and posture. So just the ability of your body to sense where it is in space to each other, and just how well you're able to control that equilibrium and posture of your body. The brainstem is the part of the brain that connects the brain to the spinal cord, and it consists of your medulla oblongata, the midbrain, and the pons. The medulla serves as a pathway for all sensory information going to the brain and all motor messages leaving the brain. The midbrain processes information about sights and sounds. The pons connects the spinal cord and cerebellum with the cerebrum, thalamus, and hypothalamus. The limbic system is defined on the basis of function rather than the actual anatomy, and it includes several brain structures that produce emotions and memory. The storage and retrieval of information takes place in 2 stages. We call it short-term memory, which holds a small amount of information for a few seconds or minutes, and long-term memory stores limitless amounts of information for hours, days, or years. So this is a look at where, here's your cerebrum, here's your pons, medulla oblongata, and this is your olfactory bulb, and some of the other parts of the brain. The reticular activating system is an extensive network of neurons that runs through your medulla and projects to the cerebral cortex. It'll filter all sensory information and keeps your cerebral cortex in a constant alert state. Your spinal cord is the source of message transmission and reflex center that connects some of the peripheral system to the brain. It's a tube of neural tissue with a central canal inside. It's protected by stacked vertebrae, which are pieces of your skeleton of the vertebral column. And the white matter is towards the surface, the gray matter is in the center. And again, the function is to conduct messages between the brain and the body. It also serves as a reflex center. So some of your reflexes that happen extremely rapidly to avoid painful situations or danger those messages won't even get up to the brain. They'll just go through the spinal cord to allow you to step off of something if you sense pain, or remove a part of the body if it's in a dangerous situation. So here's a look at how your spinal cord goes through the vertebra, your bones of the spinal column. You can see spinal nerves coming off of the spinal cord itself. And if we take a cross section of the spinal cord, you can see how it creates this butterfly shape appearance of white matter on the outside and gray matter on the inside. And you can also see how even the spinal cord, like the brain, has these 3 layers of protective coverings called meninges. A reflex is an autonomic response to a stimulus in a pre-wired circuit called a reflex arc. It'll have a receptor, a sensory neuron, an interneuron, a motor neuron, and an effector. And spinal reflexes are decisions made by the spinal cord without traveling up to the brain when a speedy reaction is safer. So this is a great look at reflexes that I would encourage you to watch. In general, though, if you step on something that feels pain, the sensory messages are carried by a sensory neuron to an interneuron in the spinal cord. It won't go up to the brain. It'll just come right out as a motor neuron that'll stimulate the appropriate muscle to contract and step off of that painful situation, like stepping on a piece of glass. The peripheral nervous system includes cranial nerves that come from the brain and spinal nerves that come from the spinal cord. You have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and each pair services a specific region of the body. All contain sensory and motor fibers. Sensory fibers enter the dorsal or posterior side of the spinal cord in a bundle we call the dorsal root. And axons of motor neurons leave the ventral or front side of the spinal cord in a bundle called the ventral root. So here's a cross section, again, of the spinal cord. You can see dorsal root contains sensory information coming in the back, and ventral root contains motor information coming out of the front. The dorsal root ganglia contains cell bodies of those neurons. And here are a look at all of the cranial nerves. We number them 1 to 12 in Roman numerals. There are different nerves that come off of the brain that have these specific effects on these organs or structures. There's 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They service the structures of the head and certain body parts like your heart and diaphragm. Some carry sensory information, some carry motor fibers, and still others can carry both types. Here's a look at peripheral cranial nerves. You can view this. Subdivisions of your peripheral nervous system, we can have your somatic or autonomic. The somatic nervous system governs all conscious sensations that you perceive consciously and everything that you control voluntarily. The autonomic nervous system governs unconscious and involuntary internal activities. And again, the sympathetic nervous system prepares the body for emergency situations, and your parasympathetic nervous system adjusts the body functions so that energy is conserved during restful times. And the two subdivisions have antagonistic effects, meaning they'll oppose each other. Here's a great look at the peripheral nervous system and the two branches. And what each branch will control, you'll see in your parasympathetic nervous system, it'll have to do with things that increase salivation for digesting, slowing your heart rate, slowing your breathing rate, widening your blood vessels, and increasing digestive activity. And then your sympathetic nervous system will do everything to react to emergencies. So getting the body ready for an emergency, dilating your pupil so you can take in as much light as possible, increasing breathing rate and heart rate, and slowing digestion. Headaches, we have tension or migraines. Tension headaches are caused by muscle contraction in the head, face, and neck. And migraine headaches are actually caused by an imbalance in the brain's chemistry, usually by low levels of the neurotransmitter serotonin. A stroke is a cerebral vascular accident, and it's caused by an interruption of blood flow, usually due to a blockage to a region of the brain, resulting in death of nerve cells. The extent and type of impairment caused by a stroke depend on the affected region of the brain. And the common causes of a stroke are when a blood clot can block a vessel within one of those arteries, or when fatty deposits can block a vessel. A coma is caused by trauma to neurons in regions of the brain responsible for stimulating the cerebrum, where the person is totally unresponsive to all sensory input and cannot be awakened, but it differs from a deep sleep. A spinal cord injury results in loss of function below the site of the injury. So depending on which nerve tracts are damaged, the injury could result in paralysis or loss of sensation, or both. If the cord is completely severed, there's complete loss of sensation and voluntary movement below the level of the cut. So after this chapter, you should be able to do these things. And again, use this as a checklist for yourself to make sure you understand the components of each chapter. Thanks for listening, guys.